All right, so today we're going to break down a sermon that just completely flips our whole idea of failure on its head. The basic idea? That our biggest mistakes, the moments we think are setbacks, might actually be part of a much bigger, divine plan. Let's see how it makes that argument. And the whole thing kicks off with this really thought-provoking question. It asks us to just consider for a second this pretty wild idea. What if those moments where you feel the most lost, the most off course, are actually exactly where you're supposed to be? So, to help us wrap our heads around this, the sermon gives us this great analogy: a maze. You know how it is in a maze, right? Sometimes, to actually get to the end, you have to turn away from it. That detour, that step that feels like you're going backward, well, it's actually the only path forward. And we're about to see how this idea gets applied to one of the most famous failures in all of history. Okay, so before we dive into that specific story, the sermon first lays out the foundation for this whole perspective. This is really the central argument that everything else is going to be built on. And there it is. That's the big idea we're unpacking. The argument isn't saying that failure is good, not at all. But from this theological point of view, it's useful. It's not a roadblock, it's a tool. So the real question is, how? And to explain that, the sermon looks at a really powerful case study. Let's get into the central story of the sermon, the arrest of Jesus and the, epic failure of his right-hand man, Peter. Now, from the disciples' perspective, this is the moment their entire world just implodes. Their leader is being taken away by force, and the whole situation is just spinning completely out of their control. And to really get why they were panicking, you have to understand the scale of what they were up against. The source points out that the band of soldiers that showed up could have been a Roman cohort of up to 600 professionally trained soldiers. Yeah, this wasn't just a couple of guards. This was an overwhelming military force coming for one guy. And it wasn't just the sheer numbers. The sermon highlights that the entire justice system was breaking down. For the disciples who knew the laws, this had to look like absolute chaos. Judges were literally involved in the arrest, testimony was being paid for. The very people who were supposed to uphold the law were just shattering it. It had to feel like everything was falling apart. And right in the middle of all this fear and confusion, we get to the really personal failure. Peter, the rock, the lead disciple. He's in the enemy's courtyard, warming himself by a charcoal fire, and 3 separate times he denies he even knows Jesus. This is the absolute bottom. Okay, so if the sermon's big idea is that God uses failure, how on earth does that apply here? Well, the source breaks it all down into a really clear 3-part argument, explaining the purpose behind what looks like a total catastrophe. So here they are, the 3 pillars of the sermon's case. It argues that these failures weren't accidents at all. They were actually essential in 3 different ways: to fulfill a much bigger plan, to demonstrate what divine grace looks like, and ultimately to strengthen faith. Let's break each of those down. First up, this idea of a divine plan. The sermon actually cites the book of Acts, which claims that all of this happened according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. So it looks like an absolute disaster to the disciples was, from this perspective, just the script playing out exactly as it was intended. Second, this idea of grace. The sermon argues that by showing how completely and utterly the human legal system failed, the story makes the case for something much more powerful. It even points to the high priest Caiaphas, who, in his attempt to condemn Jesus, actually, without realizing it, prophesied that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. And that third point about growing our faith is summed up so powerfully by this quote from the story of Joseph in Genesis. The idea here is that even when people act with evil intentions, those actions can be repurposed for a greater good. The opposition, the failure, it becomes the very thing that sparks growth and deliverance. Kind of like a muscle has to be torn down before it can grow back stronger. And now we get to what is really the emotional heart of this entire argument. It all hinges on this tiny little detail that the eyewitness, John, includes in his story, a detail that, at first, seems totally random. And this is where it all clicks. The sermon creates this powerful parallel between 2 different fires. The first one, it's the charcoal fire of Peter's failure, his denial. But later, after the resurrection, Jesus makes breakfast for his disciples over another charcoal fire. The very setting of the crime becomes the scene of redemption, where Jesus brings Peter back into the fold. The fire of fear literally becomes the fire of fellowship. So, how does this all tie back together? Well, to get to the final conclusion, the sermon zooms all the way back out, returning to that first analogy it gave us, the maze. And that brings us to the ultimate takeaway from this whole sermon, which is this: failure isn't a deviation from the path, it is the path. The wrong turns, the moments of weakness, all the opposition, they're all part of that winding road that eventually gets you to the finish line. And that leaves us with one last question to think about. If we were to actually use this framework, this map, how might that change the way we look at the setbacks and the wrong turns in our own stories? What if all those detours are actually the destination?